Thanks so much. Thank you, Kate, and thank you, Brenda, for this opportunity. It's always great to spend an evening with you guys here. Thank you for coming out, especially on a wonderful night like tonight. It feels like we might have almost turned the corner. I don't want to jinx us, but I'll tell you, it definitely feels like we made it, you know. I know we've all said that before and then get hit with a northeaster. Well, I really hope that this evening's talk will give you a model with which you can change at least part of your health and really change maybe the trajectory of your health and of the course of your life. It's something that I think really embodies so many of the most important nutrition principles. You know, when Kate asked me what I would like to do for this, this talk, for the past year or so, I've been really doing a lot of research in this area of nutrition because I think it explains not only how we can all age better and live healthier, longer lives, but really how we can reduce our risk for developing cancer and how we can reduce our risk for developing a host of neurodegenerative diseases, which really are at an all-time high. I mean, I'm sure everybody in here knows somebody who has been afflicted with Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, or has had a real serious cognitive decline once they hit age 65 or 70. This really speaks volumes to that topic because in essence, not to bring you back to high school biology, I know a lot of you would cringe if I did that. But I will say that I think most of the important lessons that we can glean around the area of nutrition, a lot of those lessons are really learned and are taught in cell biology, in microbiology. I know a few of you have had a chance to hear me talk about the importance of the microbiome. Those are the 4 to 5 pounds of bacteria and other life forms that inhabit our distal small intestine and our large intestine, and in some cases our stomach, and really make us who we are. They turn on genes that control everything from our outlook on life to our risk for developing, a long list of conditions. So all these different areas of biology, whether it's microbiology or cell biology or biochemistry, that's really where if we can step back and we can separate ourselves from the belief systems that have really popped up throughout the field of nutrition. That's the best way for me to really describe the various factions that people align themselves with now. One person's very passionate about being paleo, another person's just as passionate, if not more passionate, about being vegan, all for a variety of reasons. But when you look at the research, it's really fascinating, the power of belief. I could conduct a study like some of the ones that have just come out in the media recently on how a high-fat diet changes, gut bacteria. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see that. That was released in a variety of different media outlets. Well, the study was published in a journal of psychiatry, and it basically showed that if you gave 25 mice a diet that was around 63 or 64% fat, that you would change the gut flora, the intestinal bacteria, and that the mice would behave differently. And so for anyone that's an advocate for a low-fat vegetarian diet like Dean Ornish or someone like that, they immediately latch onto that and they have written about it already in the past few days. What the average person doesn't know is that if you take a look at a study like that, it's really clear. The mice that were giving 64% of their diet in the way of fat, about 80% of the fat they were given was soybean oil, highly refined soybean oil, and some of it was even hydrogenated. How many people really know the details with respect to a study like that? It's really unfortunate. Those mice were also given about 10% of their calories in the way of added sugar. And the mice that were on the 13% fat diet, the standard mouse diet, whatever that looks like, they didn't have the high level of soybean oil, they didn't have any added sugar, and they actually had a more natural profile of fiber from the grains and things that made up their diet, whereas the mice that are on the high-fat diet had to have cellulose added to their diet. So it's just really my whole point in this brief description of the study is that we're really, a lot of us are frustrated, confused, regardless of our level of education with respect to nutrition, because research can be designed in a way where you're going to produce an outcome that you want as a researcher. That's really clear. But what we can always drop or step back, if possible, we can always step back and look at as a kind of a big picture, a 30,000-foot perspective on things is really look at a human cell. Take a look at things like, what you're actually made up of, and that's what I want to get into tonight. Take a look at our ancestry. Take a look at, human populations that have lived for thousands of years before any of these choices were even possible. So that's what I really want to do tonight. I want to focus on the mitochondria because, as I started to say, the mitochondria are really the most important component of our cells if we want to maintain cellular health. Everybody focuses on genes and on genetics, and that's, of course, very, very important. But what a lot of people do not realize is that those genes really don't amount to anything if the cell can't survive, if it can't produce enough energy on a regular basis to maintain the higher level of order that's required for everything from the cell membrane to producing proteins to what we call aerobic respiration. And the mitochondria are responsible for all of that. And so you're made up of about 1 trillion cells, give or take a few million, right? Every single one of your cells contains a large number of these little organelles, these little tiny powerhouses as they're described in high school biology and are continued to be described right up through a postdoc graduate research program. This is where energy is produced in our mitochondria. Every single thing you eat has to be broken down into either glucose, hopefully not too much fructose, which we'll get to in a while, fatty acids, or amino acids, okay? And all of those things, ultimately, those individual building blocks for the food that we eat have to be run through the mitochondria in an effort to produce ATP. That is the currency of energy in the body, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. And so without this process, without being able to convert the food that you've eaten and has been transported by your blood to your mitochondria, if you can't convert it to energy, then the cell starts to fall apart. It starts to break down. And then we start to break down. It's really that simple. And as we get older, the primary reason why as we get older we have less energy than we did when we were half of our age has a lot to do with the function of our mitochondria. As mitochondria become leaky and less efficient, less effective at this conversion process, we break down, we have less energy, and then, unfortunately, we start to invite disease into the picture because so many diseases are really the pivotal mechanism in the etiology of the disease is an inability to maintain order. So we'll get into that in a little while, especially when we talk about neurodegenerative diseases and certain types of cancers. But the mitochondria are what I want to talk about in the way of nourishment tonight. Because at no time in human history, barring a few periods of time when there have been widespread, famines, food shortages, some major outbreaks of infectious disease, but at no time in human history have we ever been so overfed and yet malnourished. And there's no part of our physiology that suffers more from that particular scenario than the mitochondria. Because what the mitochondria do in the process of making energy for us is, unfortunately, it's just part of it's part of the process, and it's actually unavoidable, is when mitochondria are taking some of the food building blocks and are running those through this inner membrane, which is called the cristae, out comes ATP to be used by the cell, and then another byproduct of that are what we call free radicals. And these free radicals, again, cannot be avoided. What you have to do is you have to eat in a certain way. You have to have certain components to your diet that will allow your body to neutralize the free radicals, because otherwise, if your mitochondria start to bathe in a high concentration of free radicals, they will ultimately put holes in these organelles, making them more leaky, thereby less efficient, less effective, and it will really speed up the entire aging process. I first got into this area in 1999 when I started my research at the University of Maine with blueberries. My research, which I did with women over the age of 60, was really based on what researchers at Tufts University had shown with rats. I'm not making any comparisons there. But, what researchers like the late James Joseph, showed with multiple studies is that these free radicals ultimately control the aging process in almost all mammalian species that have been studied to date. And if you present any mammal with a high enough concentration of antioxidants, such as from blueberries, blackberries, it's also been done with things like pomegranates and spinach, then what will happen is you neutralize enough of these free radicals, and you ultimately preserve mitochondrial health, and it allows whatever mammal species it is you're studying to live longer and to have a better quality of health as they get older. It's really that simple. That's why when rats were given blueberries at 3% of their diet and they were sacrificed 2 months later, so that they're the equivalent of a you or I being 96 years old, they actually looked younger in every single way other than they still had white whiskers. In every way. When their neurons were looked at, the neurons actually looked like the neurons of a younger mouse. And neurologically, they functioned much better. They had better balance. They had better stamina. Really, everything you want to happen happened. So, and that has been shown with other species, not just, and certainly not just with blueberries. But what we're starting to see now with human trials is that we can also produce very favorable results with things like intermittent fasting. How many of you are familiar with what intermittent fasting is? Yeah, good. I know a few of you have probably heard me talk about this in one place or another in the past couple of years. Intermittent fasting is when you just, you maybe take 16 hours out of every 24 hours where you just don't eat. It's that simple. So it's not as though you're fasting for a complete 24 hours, but you wake up in the morning and you maybe have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea, and you can actually put some things in your coffee or tea like full-fat cream or some butter, whatever it would be. It would have to be mostly fat-based because fat doesn't interrupt the benefits of fasting like carbohydrates or protein do. And so with intermittent fasting, you give your body a break, you produce less free radicals, but you still have a great enough, hopefully, pool of antioxidants and nutrients with which you can use for detoxification purposes in your liver, and that your mitochondria can still use for this conversion process of food to energy. But intermittent fasting has really caught on. It's extremely popular right now because so many people are having great results with it, not only for just feeling better and having more energy, but intermittent fasting is really helping a lot of people who have things like MS or Parkinson's get back on their feet, literally. So that would be one example of the most contemporary research showing that eating less, not going into a starvation state, but eating less really can foster better mitochondrial health and better cellular health overall. Other areas of research which are also depicting a very, very clear picture here with respect to what we can do to take care of our mitochondria are the damaging effects of statins. If you're not familiar with what statins are, they go by the names Lipitor, Mevacor, Crestor. There's really a long list of them now. And statins are prescribed routinely in this country for anybody who has a cholesterol over 200. In fact, I now see people who are given statins for cholesterols of 180, 170, almost as though there is no safe cholesterol level. That's really the message that is, in a way, being disseminated through physicians' offices, because if you leave your physician's office with a total cholesterol of 180, then your triglyceride to HDL ratio is 1 to 1, it's really clear that there is no apparent, target range here for a total cholesterol if a statin is still being prescribed for that particular scenario. And if you start to look at some of the meta-analysis which have been done with various populations on statins, it's really clear they have a number of different side effects, none of which I promise you want. And the greatest impact of statins, really the greatest impact, is going to be on mitochondrial health. Now, most people who are on a statin are told to take CoQ10. How many people, just a show of hands, how many people have been told to take CoQ10 if they're on a statin, or they know someone who's on a statin has been told to take CoQ10? Oh, that's sobering. That should be, that should any statin, not that I'm a fan of statins being prescribed in the first place, but surely enough, if a statin is going to be prescribed, that is something that has to be prescribed with it. The reason this is such really a sharp knife here is that statins turn off cholesterol production throughout the body. Okay, they do not just turn off cholesterol production, let's say in your liver or in your working muscles. They turn off cholesterol production throughout the body because of the way they interact with an enzyme known as HMG-CoA reductase. Now, that enzyme is something that we've evolved with over the past 250,000 years. And I can assure you that when you turn off cholesterol production throughout the body in an effort to drive levels, to some point, and I don't think anybody has any idea what that magic number is, but I can assure you cholesterol is not the reason that people have heart attacks or develop heart disease. But if you continue to drive your cholesterol levels down throughout your body, you're going to compromise brain health, you're going to compromise cardiac muscle health, In fact, there's a wonderful paper that shows very clearly people who have congestive heart failure have better long-term outcomes, much better survivability if they have really high cholesterols than if they have low. Think about that. So we've got people, I don't know how many people in this country have congestive heart failure or have the early signs of it, but I can assure you it's a significant number. And yet a lot of these people are being given statins in an effort to lower their cholesterol levels even more when the research clearly shows if you have congestive heart failure, you want your cholesterol levels to be as high as possible. Otherwise, your cardiac muscle is going to run out of the primary building block that allows it to maintain mitochondrial health. And I'll tell you, if there is a muscle in your body that needs to work all the time, it's your heart. And once it's depleted in CoQ10, things don't go in the right direction. Now, a much similar model is now being painted with respect to brain health. You turn off cholesterol production in the brain, and you have really started to deprive the brain of the mortar that holds all the bricks together. You know, people like Dr. Perlmutter, who has written the book Grain Brain. I don't know how many of you have had a chance to read that or see that. It's really well done. You know, he really, it does a wonderful job of highlighting the research in this area. So, really, that is another major area where we are shortchanging our mitochondria. Statins, recommending them for so many people who don't need them in the first place. And then if you really look at the long-term efficacy of statins, I think a baby aspirin matches up fairly well to statins, because statins, if they do improve our outcome, it has to do with their anti-inflammatory effects, not because they lower cholesterol levels. And any cardiologist that really is abreast of the research and understands what has been shown will tell you that. I've had countless cardiologists tell me in professional trainings that I've given, come up to me and say, absolutely, the only reason Crestor works is because it's anti-inflammatory. So, there are a lot of things you can use to reduce inflammation without turning off cholesterol production throughout the body. So those are two really important areas to consider. Intermittent fasting, really giving the use of a statin a long thought process before you sign up for that. And then the other major area is how many people are drowning in fructose every day. Fructose, which, is one of the most common sugars in the world and does make up 50% of table sugar, which we call sucrose. For those of you who are not familiar with this, sucrose is 50% glucose and 50% fructose, okay? So those two molecules make up the unit that we call sucrose or table sugar. Now, a lot of people are familiar with high fructose corn syrup and realize that that stuff is toxic. But how many people know that research now has shown humans will only tolerate somewhere between 24 and 26 grams of fructose per day? It doesn't matter where it's coming from. It can be coming from a couple Nutri-Grain bars, it can be coming from your high fructose corn syrup sweetened beverage, or it could be coming from 3 bananas. It really doesn't matter. If you go beyond 26 grams of fructose per day, you have just dialed up inflammation throughout the body. Inflammation, which is going to have the greatest overall damaging effects on mitochondrial health. So fructose is really something to keep tabs on in your diet. And I have posted recently on Facebook a list of fruits and vegetables which have the highest fructose contents and those which have the lowest. And a lot of people that I have great respect for, who I consider colleagues and friends, have sent me emails saying, hey, don't you think you should tone it down a little bit and kind of give fruit a pass? Shouldn't you just focus on high fructose corn syrup? And part of me says, yeah, I get it. Like, I understand that, we don't have this epidemic of obesity and diabetes in this country because people have been eating too many apples, okay? However, the one thing that I do want to highlight is that I got a lot of people that come in my office and they're told not to drink sweetened beverages, but they're told to snack on fruit throughout the day. They're told to have trail mix, dried fruit. A half a cup of raisins has 50 grams of fructose in it. So that's more than twice what you should really have in the day, and a half a cup of raisins. But because raisins are all natural, high in potassium, high in fiber, right? They can be organic. I mean, the list goes on and on. A lot of people think that you can't really overdo dried fruit. You can't overdo things like bananas and apples. But I think it's important that, we have so many people out there with diabetes and so many people now with insulin resistance that I think it's important people understand that it's great to eat fruit and to use fruit as a dessert, but don't give fruit a pass as though you can't get too much sugar from it, because it happens, and it happens pretty quickly for people who have insulin resistance. So those are just 3 areas that really give you, I hope, a clear picture as to where all these problems are coming from with respect to mitochondrial health. So now what I want to do is I want to step back again. I want to take a look at who we are, what we're made up of, take a little bit of a peek at our ancestry and what human populations have eaten for long periods of time with great success, probably the best success. And, you know, try to tie this together and give you an idea as to what a healthy diet could look like. Okay, so the first thing that I want everyone to know here is that the mitochondria is made up of a phospholipid bilayer in the same way that our cells are made up of. So this phospholipid bilayer is basically a membrane made up of the fats in our diet and some of the fats that we manufacture. It also contains cholesterol and things like CoQ10 and all types of lipids. Now, why I'm going into this is every single meal that you eat that contains fat will ultimately determine, at least to some extent, the composition that you're going to find in this phospholipid bilayer. So for instance, if you left this lecture tonight and you went home and you just ate walnuts for the next 2 weeks, that's all you ate for fat was walnuts. If I took your red blood cells out and I looked at them with an electron microscope 2 weeks later, we would see a much, much greater percentage of what we call alpha-linolenic acid, a type of omega-3 fat. We'd see a lot more of these polyunsaturated fats, which we call, abbreviation is PUFA. We'd see very high levels of these from eating so many walnuts in the next 2 weeks. Now, the significance of that is that once you start to make your phospholipid bilayer, and even worse, once you start to make your mitochondrial phospholipid bilayer out of a very high level of polyunsaturated fats, let me ask you this. What's the shelf life like on these? Not very good. They go rancid really quickly, right? Do you ever want to cook with flax oil? No, absolutely not. Do you ever want to leave a polyunsaturated fat out in the heat or in the sunlight? Absolutely not. The reason being is they are polyunsaturated fats because they contain more than one double bond, and in chemistry all you need to know is they react with oxygen really quickly. Now, the significance of that metabolically and clinically is that if you make your phospholipid bilayers out of all these polyunsaturated fats from eating lots of vegetable oils, I don't even know why we call them vegetable oils, they're not made from vegetables, right? They're made from things like corn, canola, soybeans, all of these, you know, really, really low quality, low cost seed oils are very high in their polyunsaturated fat content. They're very inexpensive, they're very cheap. That's why, you know, most of our processed food contains very high levels of them. When you start to incorporate those into your phospholipid bilayer of your mitochondria or your cell membrane, really what you are doing is turning up the generation or the production of free radicals, because every time you go for a walk, every time you sit down after a big meal and you have this aerobic respiration going on, which is how your cells manufacture energy, every molecule of oxygen that bounces into that mitochondrial membrane is going to generate free radicals that is going to ultimately put holes in those mitochondria. Okay, now how do we know this? Because we've done really, really good research in the way of molecular biology, looking at cell membranes and how changing the diet of a mammal changes cell composition and how it changes the aging process of the mitochondria or the cell overall. So what I'm saying is that when researchers want to speed up the aging process in a laboratory animal to study some type of, you know, mechanism with cancer or in the field of oncology, they don't give them coconut, they don't give them butter, they don't give them lard, they give them sunflower oil, safflower oil, walnut oil, flax oil. You give animals polyunsaturated fats when you want to wreak havoc on their mitochondria to research the aging process or the effects of different cancer, you know, cancer treatment drugs. This is, you know, this is really common knowledge. It's not to the average consumer. And a lot of people don't connect the dots for whatever reason. You know, we're still told by people like Walter Willett at Harvard, who is the chair of their nutritional epidemiology department and developed the food guide pyramid based on the Mediterranean pyramid. You know, we're still told to eat more polyunsaturated fats than saturated fats, which for me is one of the, I call that the eighth mystery of the world, really. If you take a look, now here's where I want to go with this. Okay, so take a look at the human body. This is what I want everyone to do. I want you to tell me what a good body composition is for a person. Do you know what our body fat percentage is? Anyone have any idea? No, not the BMI. Like 30%? 30% would be what we would measure if we use calipers, right? We measured body fat percentage that was subcutaneous fat. It might not measure all of our intramuscular fat, but it would measure the fat that if you stood in front of a mirror you'd see, right? Okay, but here's what I want you to understand. The brain is all fat. The phospholipid bilayer that I've talked about is all fat of different types. So you're made up of a little over 1 trillion cells. Every single cell is mostly fat. Here's the long and the short of the story. You are 60 to 70% fat if we count cholesterol, if you count all the different types of fats that make up this phospholipid bilayer, all the different lipids that make us who we are, the myelinated sheath of our neurons, everything. You add it all up, we're between 60 and 70% fat. Okay? Now, how much of that fat is saturated fat?
Is adipose tissue saturated?
How much of your adipose tissue is saturated fat? If you had to guess, your nerve, think about nervous tissue, think about the fat, intramuscular fat, the fat that wraps itself around every single cell. So just all the fat in your body, what percentage of our fat do you think is saturated?
Most of it? So we say
Absolutely. Absolutely most of it. 3/4 of our body is made up of saturated fat. 3/4. Okay? About 15, now this is variable depending on what you eat. If you ate a lot of olive oil, you might have 60% saturated fat. You might have 25 to, maybe even 30% monounsaturated fat. You might only have 10% polyunsaturated fat. I would look at that as being awesome in comparison to what the average American's at. Absolutely, that would be awesome. Because you know what the average American's is? The average American now has about 15 to 18% polyunsaturated fat in their cells based on, what we call fatty acid analysis. You can be done at most physicians' offices now through a lab like Quest Diagnostics. Genova does it as well. You do a fatty acid analysis on someone and it will tell you exactly the types of fats they're eating because you're going to see it. You're going to see it in a display. It's really amazing. Okay, now the point of this is if you left here and ate all these walnuts, you would increase the generation of free radicals that would really compromise the mitochondria that we've been talking about. However, if you leave here and you just started eating butter and coconut and you were using more, let's say, lard, you were using more animal fat, you had some palm oil maybe in your diet, and the rest of your diet came from things like avocados, macadamia nuts, olives or olive oil, which are mostly monounsaturated fat, you will give your body the specific fatty acids that will be ideal for comprising it out of. And you will not have all of these polyunsaturated fats woven into your cell membranes that are free radicals in the making, and you'll also keep inflammation much, much lower because saturated fat, in addition to being very resistant to oxidative stress, it also, you don't use saturated fat to generate eicosanoids like the thromboxanes and the leukotrienes and the prostaglandins that can do everything from make our blood thicker and make us more likely to have a clot to increasing levels of inflammation. So saturated fat, surprising I can see to some of you based on your facial expressions, I'm a huge fan of saturated fat. And if you had told me that, 20 years ago when I was leaving my master's program, I was a huge Dean Ornish fan. And I still am for many reasons. I mean, Dean does great things in helping people understand the connection between stress and heart disease and, getting people to meditate and to walk. I think he does remarkable work in that way. But when we start to really look at the role of fat in the diet, it's really clear that if you continue to eat the large amounts of polyunsaturated fats that a lot of people in the industrialized world are, that the only reason you would want to eat more polyunsaturated fats is to lower your cholesterol levels, but lowering your cholesterol levels doesn't get you anywhere. It doesn't reduce your risk of having a heart attack, and it only increases your risk of developing a long list of other conditions you don't want. It also lowers your testosterone levels. I mean, it causes major problems for gut health because a lot of intestinal microbes do not like polyunsaturated fats and are destroyed by even modest quantities of them. So polyunsaturated fats need to make up approximately 6% of our diet, with about 3% coming from omega-3s and about 3% from omega-6s. Which means if you want to have walnuts, that's great, but have a small handful of them, maybe a small handful every day. And if you want to have oily fish, that's great. That could be one of your proteins every day because the small amount of omega-3s you're going to get from a can of sardines or from a piece of salmon at the end of the day, it's probably going to end up about 3% of your polyunsaturated, of your total fat intake. And that's really what you're looking for. You want your saturated fat to be somewhere around 60 to 70% of the fat in your diet, and you want monounsaturated fats to make up the rest. What's in between? How do you do that? You cook with butter or coconut oil if you're going to cook anything at least a moderately high heat. The polyunsaturated fats don't even stand up to it anyways. You use olive oil for your salad dressings. You try to have avocados whenever you're hungry. It's one of the best things you can snack on. It's really one of the top 5 foods you could eat day in and day out without causing problems. We live in the wrong place for me to say that, I know. I mean, half the ones you buy, you know, you bring them home, they got brown spots all through them, and you're like, wow. But coconut, avocados, macadamia nuts, olive oil, really good grass-fed butter, you know, which is the Co-op has several really good brands there, whether it's Kerrygold from Ireland, which they only get about, you know, 4 to 5% of their diet in the way of grain, a little bit of GMO grain to Kerrygold's admittance, but at least they admit, and it's a very, very small percentage of what their animals get. And then you've got like the Great Hopes Farm, which is a local raw, you know, grass-fed Jersey cows. They sell them in the 1-pound block there. You know, so you got coconut oil, you got butter for a lot of your high-temperature cooking. You can cook with olive oil at a low temperature, but you really want to keep most of the fat that you eat saturated. Now, a lot of people will shake their head when they hear me say this. How can this be? Here's the other thing to consider. What would be the most perfect food for the human body? Can you think of what would be the absolute most perfect food for the human body? Oh, come on. That's pretty good. That's pretty funny, though. I like that. Very creative. How about something else that we need when we're developing? Breast milk. That was what I was looking for, but that's okay. I guess a lot of people don't consider it a food, but it's really nature's most perfect food. If you look at breast milk, and you really think about, you just think about biology, and you think about what a developing child, a developing brain needs, and think about that in many areas of the world, kids are breastfed till they're 4 years old, 5 years old, not for the first few months of their life. Why would nature have given a developing body the perfect food that's about 58% saturated fat? If saturated fat was going to cause problems, inflammation, if it was going to cause problems with gut and microbial health, it obviously wouldn't have happened. I mean, you're talking about the most perfect food at the most critical time in a human being's life. It's ideal. Think about this. Another thing, if you were to leave this room and not to eat for a couple days, all right, come back to me. I see a few people getting upset, but if you were to leave here and not eat for a couple days, tell me where you'd be getting your energy from after the first day. Where would it be coming from? Fat. Exactly. And what kind of fat? Exactly. You'd be getting most of your energy from saturated fat. You really want to eat foods in the ratios that they're going to be catabolized in your body. You don't want a diet that's 70% carbohydrate when in a fasting state you're getting about 8% of your energy from carbohydrates. That doesn't make sense. But this is the way we're telling people to eat. We're telling people to eat whole grains, which are largely not compatible with the human gut. The microbes in our gut that we want to have hate grains. That's just that simple. And you know, if you want a condition like ankylosing spondylitis and you want to have Klebsiella in your gut, well, then you eat a lot of grains. But if you don't want those conditions, you stay the hell away from grain, because what they do is they feed the wrong microbes that cause things like autoimmune conditions. Okay, but we're telling people to eat whole grains, high fiber from grains, which is not a fermentable fiber. It doesn't do anything for us but give us a big bowel movement. That's it. That's the end of the story. And we're telling people to get 3/4 of energy from carbohydrates when the body, you know, it's literally, we're drowning in carbohydrates. It's that simple. I don't think everybody in this room needs to go on a ketogenic diet, but I do think a lot of people need to consider the amount of carbohydrates in their diet, how it relates to everything from mitochondrial health to your blood sugar control, and consider a diet that's 60-20-20 to be a pretty decent sweet spot for most of us, regardless of our level of health. Meaning that if you got Parkinson's, I'll take 60-20-20 over what you're going to be told by a lot of registered dietitians. I'll promise you that. Okay? Maybe it's not, you know, the 80% fat, 15% protein, and 5% carbohydrate that I would recommend in my office, but 60-20-20 is a hell of a lot closer than, you know, than the other end of the spectrum. If you're in great health, 60-20-20 is probably going to keep you in great health. So 60% of your energy comes from fat, 20% from protein, and 20% from carbohydrate. And you know, there's a lot of
flexibility with the types of carbohydrates that you're going to eat or that you might want to eat. Some of you might want to have white rice. I think that's fine. I'll take white rice over any other grain on the planet. Maybe buckwheat withstanding. It might be the only one that would stand head to head with white rice. And we can talk about this a little later if we have time. But if white rice is allowed to cool, it forms what we call resistant starch. It retrogrades, so it becomes much more complex. It becomes very, very difficult for you to get any glucose out of it. Yet when it gets into your colon, it feeds all the right bacteria because it's resistant starch, and it's not the kind of starch that you'd get if that rice was all hot and fluffy, or the kind of starch you'd get from eating like a slice of whole wheat bread or anything like that. So 60-20-20 is just a really good rule of thumb. And if you go online, MyFitnessPal, it's free. It takes about 2 minutes to make an account. You can enter in the food that you've eaten for a day, and it's going to tell you what your breakdown is in terms of percent fat, percent protein, and percent carbohydrate. MyFitnessPal.com. Again, I have no affiliation with this website, and I would never use it for the research that I'm involved with because it's very rudimentary. I mean, it's just going to give you carbohydrates, fats, protein, the energy and calories that comes from those. It's not going to tell you, the amount of omega-3s in your diet or the amount of fiber in your diet, but it's going to give you a really good picture. And if you're eating whole foods, if you're eating things like, lots of green leafy vegetables, and you're having, avocado, and you're having, let's say, some grass-fed meat or some oily fish, and you enter all that in, it's going to tell you at the end of the day where your ratios are. And I think it's a really good starting point for a lot of people. Okay?
Based on like traditional thoughts though, so it will yell at you, or like put an alert if it will say, oh, you had too much fat today or something.
That's a good point. So it will tell you that you may have had too much fat for the day. Just disregard that. But it's a good point. It's a very good point. So it's going to try to give you the, the typical, whatever we want to call it. I'll refrain from some of the terminology I typically use. But yeah, it's going to tell you you've gone over your fat for the day, or you haven't got enough carbohydrate for the day. Just, you got to find a way to get out of that mindset. Good point. Yeah, so that's myfitnesspal.com. That's a good starting point if you want to really look at how many of your calories are coming from fat. But again, 60% is a good target number for all of us, regardless of our level of health. Again, whether you have diabetes, you have a neurodegenerative disease, you're battling cancer, you have heart disease, I really think that you should make more of your diet out of fat than any other macronutrient. Okay, so what are we looking at? Well, we're looking at what we're made up of. We're looking at breast milk. And I know a lot of this won't suffice as an argument in favor of a high-fat diet for everybody. A lot of us have this entrained belief system for the last 40 years that fat causes disease. It all started with Ansel Keys and the 7-country study, which is far from what we'd want to call science. It's just been perpetuated over the years with studies on rhesus monkeys that are basically being drowned in olive oil. I mean, look, the list goes on, but the bottom line is if we want to take it another step, let's take a look around the world at some populations that eat very large quantities of saturated fat and have robust levels of health. The Sri Lankans. How many people have been to Sri Lanka? Okay, well, it's a great destination. If you haven't been there, I highly recommend it, especially with the winter like we've had here. Sri Lankans get 73% of their calories from saturated fat. Almost 3/4. Now, you know where it's coming from, right? Exactly, coconut. They get 73% of their energy from saturated fat, and they have the lowest risk of heart disease in the world, period. That's it. They are numero uno. Yet if I read the American Heart Association's garbage that they put on everywhere, and I go into a grocery store and I see the little red heart on a bottle of canola oil, they'll lead you to believe that the coconut oil is going to kill you and that the canola oil is your saving grace. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'll take 3/4 of my energy from coconut oil over 2% from canola oil with what we know about canola oil today. So, really saturated fat is being consumed in large quantities by a lot of traditional Polynesian, Pacific Islander populations who have really, really good health and very, very low risk for cardiovascular disease until they develop a more westernized or a more industrialized diet, which is made up of polyunsaturated fats at a much lower quantity of their overall diet, more sugar, more refined carbs, and everything goes in the wrong direction. So we have a lot of populations out there. There were I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Pacific Northwest's history. The Native Americans that harvested candlefish there, you know, in where we now know as, you know, Oregon, Washington, all the way up into Alaska. The candlefish is very unique. The candlefish is about 80% monounsaturated fat. It's a little sardine-like fish, and it's called the candlefish because you can actually burn them like a candle because their fat content is that high once they're dried in the sun. So it's also called the Oolachan, O-O-L-I-C-H-A-N. The Oolachan fish actually is the first source of monounsaturated fat in the world. Not olive oil, okay? But the candlefish was around for about 5,000 to 6,000 years as part of a central constituent or staple to the Pacific Northwest Native American diet. It made up anywhere from, you know, again, 2/3 to 3/4 of their overall fat intake and their overall calories. You know, you've got the Great Plains Indians that were making pemmican from the lard from bison. Only when the bison had eaten grass all summer long and it was very high in saturated fat. They wouldn't do that with animals that they killed in the spring because it had too much polyunsaturated fat in it because the animals were starting to live off of their stores through the winter. I mean, you just go down through anthropology and you go down through human culture and it's really clear. Saturated fat has been the rudder for every human population on the planet until the last few thousand years. So then the last thing I want to leave you with is, can you think of a mammal on this planet that doesn't eat mostly saturated fat? Someone's going to tell me a giraffe or a horse or a goat, right? I know one of you wants to say it, right? The answer is this. There isn't a mammal on this planet that doesn't eat a saturated fat-based diet.
What about cows when they're fed corn?
When they're fed corn. All right, you got me. But if an animal's allowed to eat grass, what's it eating? Fiber. What has to happen for that fiber? What are they going to absorb? They're going to absorb what we call short-chain fatty acids. So the cow eats the grass, the giraffe eats the leaves, the gorilla eats the leaves. Gorillas, by the way, don't live on bananas. That's one of the biggest myths out there. They die when you do them. When you take a gorilla in a zoo and you just give them bananas, they die. Okay, I think probably a lot of you know that. But so here's the deal. An animal eats a lot of fiber. The microbes in their intestines convert the fiber to short-chain fatty acids, which are saturated fats. It's that simple. They don't absorb pieces of fiber into their bloodstream, and they're certainly not getting sugar unless they're being fed corn. So your point's exactly right. That's why animals get so sick, though, when you feed them corn. Then they get endotoxemia. Exactly. So when you look at every single mammal on this planet, of course, carnivores like lions and wolves, they get their fat-based diet from actually eating the animals that they prey on. But they don't go they don't want filet mignon, right? What do they? They want the brain, they want the liver, they want the fattiest cuts of the animal. They leave all the lean cuts for the vultures or the jackals. Is everybody with me? A few people are getting turned off by, I think, where this lecture is going. In a minute, I'm going to bring a small carcass out here and we're going to divvy it up. No, but really the point of these things that I have so much fun going off on as tangents is that, you know, we're a mammal. We've evolved over the last couple 100,000 years to eat a certain way. Every early human culture has used fat as the rudder, almost always saturated fat, and if anything else, it's been monounsaturated fat. We don't do well in a carbohydrate-based diet. I mean, we do well in one area, and that's that we can maybe lower our cholesterol levels, but again, we're chasing windmills with that approach. So the bottom line is we're a mammal. We're given breast milk, hopefully, for the first couple of years of our life. It's mostly saturated fat, and that pattern should continue throughout life. And if it doesn't, some people will still live a decent, long, healthy life, despite the fact that they have oatmeal every morning for breakfast and they don't eat, you know, eggs cooked in grease. Some people will live really long, healthy lives, despite the fact that they have bananas throughout the day, or they eat lots of fruit, or they drink a glass of fruit juice every morning. So I'm not saying that you got to do everything that I'm talking about here to live a long, healthy life. But what I am saying is that if we were to step back for a moment away from the belief systems that I started talking about and really took a look at what biology teaches us, what nature teaches us, what biochemistry teaches us, what agriculture teaches us, you know, what mammalian physiology or zoology teaches us, you really start to take a look at things from afar, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear we don't want to have a diet that's mostly carbohydrate and we want to keep the fat content pretty low. I mean, has that worked for the last 40 years? Obviously not. I mean, that's what we've been told to do, again, since the early 70s, and it's not working in any one way, shape, or form. People are getting bigger, they're more diabetic, people are having more cancer. I mean, it's just nothing's going the way that you would think it would unless you step back again and you're like, wow, look at the sugar in the average person's diet. Look at the lack of fermentable fiber. All the fiber's coming from bran. It's being added to breakfast cereals and energy bars and Power Bar. We're adding sawdust and bran to food in an effort to get to that target number for fiber, but the kind of fiber we're adding to our diet can't be fermented by the microbes in our gut, and that's the ticket. Like, if you can't ferment fiber in your gut, forget about it. Don't even eat it. Just be constipated. Because hopefully you'll go out quick. You won't suffer, Seriously, I mean, you gotta get fiber from things like leeks and spinach and from berries and from almonds. You don't want to get your fiber from, Raisin Bran and Total and stuff like that. One more minute and then we'll take some questions, just so I don't forget where I am. Okay, so does that help? Yeah, maybe. Maybe a little more confusion, but that's the most important thing you think about with mitochondrial health is where am I getting my fat from? Am I getting too much polyunsaturated fat? Then we've talked a little bit about cholesterol and why it is you don't want to just keep turning cholesterol production down in the body. The sweet spot, in my opinion, is you want your cholesterol levels to be between 200 and 240. Now, if they're 190, that's pretty good. If they're 270, I think it's fine. I don't care about someone's total cholesterol levels until they get under 150. Then that's a problem. I'll tell you a little, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about myself. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But here's the deal. When I was a vegan, when I was at the University of North Carolina, I was riding my bike, 10 miles a day because I didn't have a car. I was really, really active, and I was living on tofu and brown rice and beans and lentils. My total cholesterol was 59. 59! 59. Now, here's where I went wrong. Okay, this is a long time ago. I talked to a few people and they said, like Lauren Cordain. How many of you know who Lauren Cordain is? He's considered the father of paleo nutrition. He's at Colorado State. Brilliant guy. I really like Lauren a lot. Lauren said, you know what, John, you're fine. He goes, we look at a lot of populations out there whose cholesterol levels are about 70 to 90. These are people living in the, non-developed world, whatever you want to call it. These are people that are out in the jungle. They are in constant contact with everything. So I took that as like, wow, okay, good. I'm a hunter-gatherer, but I wasn't hunting or gathering other than for tofu and brown rice. But nevertheless, I looked at it as being, hey, it must be okay. I must be in great shape, right? No, what I learned in the years to follow is that the reason everybody has such a low cholesterol level especially in the tropics, is they all have parasites. And I had a parasite. And the parasite loved my tofu. And it loved my lipids. And so my triglycerides were like in the 20s or 30s. I always attribute it to exercise, vegetarian diet, but that's not the case. The bottom line was I had a parasite. And when you have protozoans in your blood, you know what they love? They love triglycerides. They love cholesterol. They can actually eat those things in your blood. This is really, has been well established. So I don't think I have it anymore. So you're trying to back up. It's not contagious, I promise. But the bottom line is, when you hear things about cholesterol levels, please keep in mind, because I didn't interpret things the way I should have 20 years ago. And it's only in the last 10 years or so I've really started to have a much, much greater appreciation for having higher levels of cholesterol. That's what you want. You want your triglycerides to be low. Don't get me wrong. You want your triglycerides to be under 80. And you want your triglycerides and your HDL, that's often referred to as your good cholesterol, you want those to be around 1 to 1. So like if you had a triglyceride of 80, and you had an HDL of 80, that's great. In fact, people like Art Agustin, who wrote the South Beach Diet, Art would tell you you're heart attack proof. You're not going to have a heart attack if your triglycerides and your HDL are 1 to 1, unless you have, some real, abnormal pattern of infectious disease that causes inflammation of the heart. So, just keep that in mind that you want to focus on triglycerides, you want to focus on HDLs, and I'll tell you this, that if you have a carbohydrate-based diet, it usually jacks the triglycerides up and it suppresses your HDLs. Happens all the time. So that's important for everyone to understand, that you don't want your cholesterol levels to just get lower and lower. You want to keep them over 180. You probably want them to be between 200 and 240 if you really look at the big picture and you look at all-cause mortality. people who have cholesterol levels between 200 and 240 live the longest. They live really long, healthy lives. And I started looking at some of the centenarian research that, it's all anecdotal in a way because you're just asking people who live to be 100, tell me about yourself. But there's some really cool stuff out there. Most people who live to be 100 have pretty high cholesterol levels, like, over 280. A lot of them are over 300. I think about my grandmother. She didn't live to be 100. She lived to be 99, pretty close. Her cholesterol was always over 360. And she'd give her doctor the bird every time that, I'm serious. Every time. She was real feisty like that, too. That probably goes a long ways. You want your cholesterol levels to be higher, especially as you get older. But you want your triglycerides to be lower. Okay, so that's the tale of two cities. The other thing that a lot of these centenarians have is a real common breakfast. It's high fat, very little carbohydrate, not that much protein. So a couple eggs cooked in a lot of grease, okay? Something like that. Yeah, maybe a couple pieces of bacon with an egg, but moderate protein to low protein, a lot of fat, and that's where this intermittent fasting, which I started talking about earlier, that's where this has really taken off. A lot of people that are doing intermittent fasting, they are adding coconut oil to their coffee, and putting it in a blender. They're having one egg maybe cooked in a lot of coconut oil or butter. That's it, and they're not hungry throughout the morning. And because they're not eating that much protein, but they're getting a lot of fat, they're not interrupting some of the processes I'm going to talk about in a moment, like autophagy, which is really the way you get your mitochondria back. So, that's another common denominator that a lot of the old-timers that, do really well, live to be 100 had, was they had super high-fat breakfasts, maybe some, coffee with cream in it and an egg or two, but they weren't having bowls of cereal, whether those cereals were hot or box cereal. They weren't having that kind of breakfast. So just, again, food for thought. Okay, now, CoQ10, what if you do have low cholesterol levels? What if you, let's just for the sake of this argument, let's say you've been on a statin. CoQ10 is probably one of the best supplements you can take. And I am not a person that thinks you should take every supplement under the sun, but this is one that, I spent just, a few hours looking at, this is 2 weeks ago, I looked at 54 different clinical papers on CoQ10, whether that was for treating people with brain tumors or people who had a neurodegenerative disease, people who had, cardiac myopathy, which is, basically your heart muscle starts to lose its ability to work for you. It starts to have really weak contractions. CoQ10 is probably the best supplement you can take if you've had a statin, if you've had, any signs of mitochondrial myopathy, which is weakness, muscle fatigue, just really low levels of energy that may or may not be associated with either low cholesterol levels or a statin. I recommend 200 milligrams of CoQ10. Probably the best CoQ10 you can take is a slow-release CoQ10 with something called PQQ. Okay, so slow-release CoQ10 with PQQ would be the absolute best supplement I would recommend for someone who's been on a statin, has a total cholesterol level of under 150, has muscle weakness, or muscles just don't seem to respond well to exercise, whether that's a hike or strength training. I think CoQ10 is really worth its weight in gold for those individuals. Okay? Now, if you don't want to take CoQ10 and you want to get it from your food, I hope you like sardines or mackerel. And even those don't stack up to what you'd get from things like the heart meat of an animal or from the liver of an animal. So you have heart meat, liver, sardines, and mackerel. Those are your 4 best sources of CoQ10. Okay? A couple questions, then I'll keep rolling.
Yes, I think this is fabulous, but I have an issue and I wonder how you can address it, is we live in such a polluted, toxic environment that goes for the seas, where the seas are dying, where there's hardly enough feed, where the sea lions, our pups are dying out of starvation. The air that we breathe has a lot of, all of the stuff that you're taking in, I don't know if this can rectify it. So
it's a great question. I don't have an answer for the limits of this the resource limits of this planet. You're absolutely right. There's not enough sardines for everybody to have a can of sardines every day. Absolutely. Good news is not everybody likes them, but again, not to make light of your point. I think it's a really good one. We're way past its carrying capacity for the most part. I will say this in favor of grass-fed meats. You know, and affordability is a whole nother discussion, like, because I believe we have a food apartheid in this country and in many areas of the world. You know, a lot of people can't afford to eat some of the foods we're talking about. You know, that's just a sobering reality of it. There are some solutions, though, but we can hopefully get to those in a little while, like sweet potatoes. Sweet potatoes are very inexpensive. They don't have to be organic. And I couldn't think of a better food than sweet potatoes, really. You know, so there are some nice solutions. But just to go back to your point, you're absolutely right. I think it's a great dialogue that we should all have with ourselves in terms of the way we're eating, the way we're living. Absolutely. But I will say this, grass-fed meat has a zero carbon footprint if it's truly grass-fed. Now, again, affordability is a whole other story, right? But if you want to look at things like grass-fed beef, or you want to look at farm-raised shellfish, that's another real good solution. Not farm-raised salmon, but farming mussels and scallops and oysters. Those things are really good to farm. You're not going to, you know, add extra strain on the marine resources by farming those like you would a fish. So I think there are some solutions, but boy, there's a lot of questions, and I really appreciate you bringing that up. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Can you talk about intermittent fasting?
Sure. So intermittent fasting can be done in a couple different ways. One would be, and let me just, for a moment here, and then I'll come back to some of your questions. One of the primary benefits to intermittent fasting is that you're going to have elevated ketones. And ketones are a wonderful substrate for your brain to use as a fuel. You probably have been told horror stories about metabolic ketoacidosis for people who have diabetes and they're on insulin and they got to drink a glass of orange juice before they go into shock. I'm not talking about that, I promise. I'm talking about nutritionally induced, not ketoacidosis, but ketosis. So you're not going into a state of metabolic acidosis where it's life-threatening, but you're producing ketones at levels that are greater than 0.5 micromoles. When you produce ketones at levels that are greater than 0.5 micromoles, you stimulate a lot of really good processes in your body. And one of those things is getting your neurological health back. Because your brains can only use two things as a fuel. And I promise you one of them is not Dunkin' Donuts. Okay? America doesn't run on Dunkin'. America runs ashore, runs aground on Dunkin'. No, what your brain can use as a fuel is glucose, okay? Right? Carbohydrate based, but even better than that, ketones. Only two things your brains can use. Now, when you don't eat for around 12 hours or so, ketone levels start to creep up in your body. And they could be really high depending on what you had as the last meal before you started this fast. But ketones increase with intermittent fasting, and so does a process known as autophagy. And autophagy really, and if you probably know your roots, it means self-consumption. And this is where your mitochondria can be devoured by your own cells. And when that happens, generally you have some biogenesis, which is the creation, especially if you exercise the right way. If you have autophagy going on because you're in intermittent fasting and you're recycling a lot of these defective, damaged mitochondria, and then a couple times a week you do some strength training and you stimulate your muscles, you can have a higher rate of biogenesis. You're actually going to be replacing damaged mitochondria with new healthy ones. That's really what we're after. And intermittent fasting stimulates both of these processes. And all it would look like is you have dinner at, let's say, 7 o'clock. And I would really encourage people that want to do this to make sure that their dinner had a couple tablespoons of either extra virgin coconut oil in it, maybe a couple tablespoons of grass-fed butter, because those two types of fats are going to allow you to produce more ketones in that overnight fast. And that's because coconut oil, I know a few of you have heard me talk about this in past lectures here at the library. Coconut oil is made up of 2/3 medium-chain triglycerides. Medium-chain triglycerides bypass normal fat metabolism in the body. They don't go via the lymphatic system. They go directly to the liver via the portal vein, and they are immediately converted to ketones. And those ketones will rise very soon after having a couple tablespoons of coconut oil, even if you're not in a serious fast or in a fasting state. It's much, much better if you're fasting, though, so I don't want you to think you could, throw a couple tablespoons of coconut oil on ice cream and, everything's going to work out all right. There's always someone that poses that question to me. But here's the deal. If you had dinner at 7 o'clock and maybe it was a piece of oily fish or a piece of meat, or maybe you didn't have any protein, maybe it was just a big salad with olive oil and maybe a little bit of cheese or some macadamia nuts on it, whatever you want it to be, if you don't eat over those nighttime hours, and you wake up in the morning, like let's say, whatever, 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, you have a cup of coffee, either black or you put some fat in it, okay? Butter, coconut oil, full cream, not the half and half stuff though, it's gotta be full cream. The half and half has too much protein in it. Then you don't eat all morning long, you don't eat until noontime. You have just had a 17-hour fast. And after the first 12 hours, these two processes really get rolling. And that's when you can start turning back the clock on an aging mitochondrial population. Does that make sense? I'm telling you, the number of people who get back their insulin sensitivity with this, that see improvements in everything from their memory to their coordination, they start sleeping better at night. I wouldn't be sharing this with you if I wasn't a firm believer in it. Now, is there a limit to how many times you should do this? Yeah. Would I want a kid to do this? No. This is not one size fits all. But I will say this, there really aren't many adults who should avoid this for at least a couple times a week. I mean, if you do this 3 times a week or 4 times a week, that might be enough. Should you do it 7 times a week? I know a lot of people who do and feel like they found the ticket. So it's just something to consider. Now, what if you don't want to do it a fast that way? Maybe you want to fast for a full 24 hours. That's when I start to be a little more concerned about people causing some long-term damage to their intestinal microbiota, their microbiome. The microbes that you have in your digestive tract need to be fed. Okay? Now, they need to be fed certain things like fermentable fiber. They don't need to be fed a lot of things that the average American is feeding them. But if you have too long of a window of time when you're not eating anything, with fiber in particular, once you start to shortchange certain microbial populations in your gut, they're going to disappear, or you're going to have really low levels of them. So I think it's good to have this kind of hybrid where you're not fasting for a full 24 hours, but you're fasting for a big enough window of time when you're asking your brain to use an alternative fuel, ketones. And again, I don't want to keep going back to this pediatric model of health, but one of the reasons kids' brains develop the way they do is because they have a lot of ketones in circulation. I mean, kids' brains who are breastfed get a lot of ketones because of what's found in breast milk. So, there's so many arguments for this, not against it. I think once in a while you'll read something in mainstream media which says, oh, it could be dangerous. And these people are they're misinformed because they're lumping this intermittent fasting, which some people will fast and they'll get maybe 0.3 or 0.4. That's still, it's still pretty good. It's not, 0.5 is what's used in research settings as, okay, this person's in ketosis. Okay, this population's in ketosis. We know good things are happening now at a neurological level. But that's what they have shorter windows of time that they're looking at the effects of this on a population or of an individual. If your ketone levels are 0.3 or 0.4, you might not be over 0.5 yet, but I can assure you, your brain getting ketones at 0.3 micromoles is a hell of a lot better than 0. So intermittent fasting, it doesn't have to be all or nothing, and it's not as though you have to. I use a ketone meter when I do this because I'm doing this for research purposes and I'm writing a book on this, and it's been really fascinating. So I use a ketone meter, and I recommend that for a lot of people I work with who have Parkinson's or who have, whose care provider knows how to use one, and their loved one has Alzheimer's. I think a ketogenic diet is a really integral part of turning back disease processes. I just want to say that. And whether you do intermittent fasting and you're not in full ketosis, or you go with an 80% fat diet, 15% protein, and 5% carbohydrate, and you do that for a week, and you really get into ketosis, and you start feeling great, and you notice that you lose a lot of weight. I mean, that's great too. But in that situation, I always want to talk to someone about making sure they add enough resistant starch to their diet, so they don't end up with dysbiosis or major gut issues. So ketones, very beneficial for our brains, very beneficial for our pancreas. For a lot of our physiology, autophagy is it's thousands and thousands of years old. It allowed humans to traverse mountain ranges and to make their way across deserts with no food, because what this does is ultimately it allows your body to recycle protein. So you're going to take all of this metabolic crud and all of these damaged mitochondria that you have inside your cells, and when the body senses that there's a protein shortage, it recycles all of that. It gets defective organelles out of the picture. It gobbles them up. Then your cells get to use that protein for restructuring and rebuilding new more functional organelles when the fast is over. Does everybody get that? So it's a great process, and you know, this happens when you're even in intermittent fasting, even if you're not fasting for 24 hours. Now, the third way that you can go about this fasting is just don't eat protein for a day, 1 day a week. So 1 day a week, you wake up, maybe you have a big salad or you have some sauteed vegetables, you know, like you throw an onion and leeks and, you know, maybe spinach or kale. Throw it all in a pan with some butter or some coconut oil. You have that. And then for lunch, maybe you have some guacamole with carrot sticks or celery sticks or a big salad. And then for dinner, you know, maybe you have a bowl of berries with some full-fat cream on it or some coconut milk. I mean, really, whatever you want, as long as it's just good carbohydrates, a lot of fermentable fiber, okay, and a lot of fat, but no protein. You can't go beyond 10 grams of protein a day, or you're going to interrupt this third method of intermittent fasting. This isn't really fasting. This is just protein fasting. You do it 1 day a week for a full 24 hours. You get the same process with autophagy. You don't get the ketones, but you still get really high rates of autophagy, and you clean up a lot of damaged cellular components. All your berries are typically really superstars when it comes to being low in their fructose content and high in their potassium content. And I look at everything in my mind. It's kind of a condition. It's an illness I'm trying to get rid of. But I look at food sometimes as a cost-benefit ratio. So like I look at tomatoes. A lot of people are told don't eat tomatoes, they're nightshades. Don't eat tomatoes, they're full of sugar. Nothing could be further from the truth when it comes to sugar. Tomatoes are one of your richest sources of potassium on the planet, and they have almost no fructose. So for a lot of people, that's where you want to get your carbohydrates from, things like tomatoes and berries, because if you run a cost-benefit analysis on things, fructose would only be one strike against it. But you've got to really look at the big picture, right? I think eating a banana once in a while is fine. Now, a green banana is a lot better than a ripe one. All right, I know, I lost a few of you, but resistant starch, yeah. So, like, I eat plantains. I was psyched to see that the co-op carries plantains. I'll eat a plantain. Is it my first choice if I want a dessert? Absolutely not. But if I boil a plantain just for a little bit, it's very, very starchy like a potato, and it has one of the richest sources of resistant starch on the planet. And resistant starch is something that the human gut does better with than any type of carbohydrate or starch on the planet. So your best source of resistant starch are, in addition to plantains, are things like purple sweet potatoes. Have you had the purple sweet potatoes yet? Yeah, and they're not that sweet, really, compared to like a garnet or a julienne. Purple sweet potatoes have 3 times the resistant starch content as a typical sweet potato. White potatoes that are boiled lightly and then allowed to cool, loaded with resistant starch. White rice, white basmati rice, which is, you know, again, boiled until the water's gone, so you're measuring out the water. You're not cooking this, you know, with too much water so you just break everything down. Some people do that. Some people will put rice in about 6 cups of water, and they'll go away for the day. And they'll come back, and it's like, you know, the rice is like, it looks like cream of wheat, right? You want to make sure you measure out 2 to 1 water to rice. When your water's done, you shut it off. You put it somewhere cool, like, you know, where we live, we can put it outside on a windowsill. So you're not, you know, warming up your entire refrigerator. In about 3 or 4 hours, half of the carbohydrate in that rice can't be absorbed by your pancreas. It can't be broken down by your pancreas, can't be absorbed by your small intestine. The half of that rice that can't be digested gets into your colon and feeds the absolute best classes of bacteria that you want.
Can you heat it back up after that?
A little bit, but if you boil it, it's going to start breaking down really fast. But you can let it come back to room temperature, no problem. No problem with coming back to room temperature, but you start adding it to a soup or something that's simmering, it's going to break down pretty quickly.
What about like quinoa?
Quinoa is not going to be a good source of resistant starch. Buckwheat is. So buckwheat is right there with white rice as being one of the best sources of resistant starch, also not having a high level of anti-nutrients. I'm not a big fan of, you know, whether it's wheat or brown rice or quinoa, because they do have really high levels of anti-nutrients. These are things that, you're right, grab onto your zinc. They won't let you... Yeah. You know, not so much the type of fiber, but the phytates. The phytate levels in a lot of these whole grains are just really, really high. And, you know, again, there's a reason why you go to Asia and you spend time with populations. There's a reason why they only eat white rice. And a lot of people are told, oh, it's for shelf life. That's not it. It's because, you know, thousands of years ago, villages watched what happened to one village when they took the time to take the bran off their rice. Wow, these people, all their kids grew to be, you know, good height, and they didn't have a lot of infectious disease. They were healthy. Here's a village up the river. They just said, "Oh, the hell, we're going to eat brown rice." Things didn't go very well for them. Yeah, and you know, this sound. I'm not really, you know, making light of this. It's real, because brown rice contains something called phytin, P-H-Y-T-I-N. It interferes with protein digestion. It really causes problems with mineral retention or mineral status in populations. So again, I know this is right up there with telling you to eat butter and coconut oil. It's like, wow. Hopefully some of you are excited about this. I promise you I will say good things about cocoa butter as well at some point. Very high in saturated fat. It's another great thing to add to your diet if you want to really get really healthy saturated fat in your diet. Buy cocoa butter. When you buy it, it's like a whitish off-white color, really creamy. You can put that with just hot water and a little vanilla powder and make your own, you know, kind of really decadent, it's not hot chocolate, but it's along those lines. So, yeah, so you got, for resistant starch, this is an important thing because it all benefits the mitochondria in one way or another. Mostly because when you feed your gut bacteria resistant starch, they produce short-chain fatty acids with it. And short-chain fatty acids are really good for everything in your body, especially reducing inflammation. And if you reduce your inflammation, you support your mitochondria. So you got plantains, green bananas, potatoes that have been boiled and allowed to cool. Now, if you take a potato and you fry it up in oil, the heat gets so, the heat is too much and the starch doesn't come back together. So boiling is the key, okay? Boiling. When you take things to really high temperatures by broiling, frying, or baking, you're not going to end up with as much resistant starch as you would if they were just boiled or simmered. So white rice, buckwheat, white potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes are of course great. Yeah, I think that's about it. Another question? Millet? You know, the reason I'm not big on millet now like I was a couple years ago is I spent about a week looking at goitrogens. Goitrogens are things that rob the body of iodine. It's amazing. Millet is the absolute worst at robbing the body of iodine. And it's not to say you can never have millet. I think you could, but you got to make sure if you have millet you take iodine, because it'll cause a major iodine imbalance fairly quickly if it's a staple of your diet. Kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, every member of the brassica family will do the same, not at the same level as millet. And I'm not saying you shouldn't eat kale. I think you should eat kale, but there's this myth, there's several myths. One is that if you want to eat raw kale, that you massage it lightly with lemon juice. I don't know where that came from. It's really hysterical. I mean, there's someday I want to do a spoof like a Saturday Night Live type sitcom here on some of these different things that just, they become urban legend. If you took kale and put it in a pot of water for 20 minutes and boiled it on high, it's still going to have more than half its goitrogens. So you don't get rid of goitrogens by cooking. They're still going to be there. Making sauerkraut or kimchi actually increases the activity of the goitrogen. But the bad news, I mean, that's the good news is it's not you have to avoid these things. It's just you got to consider taking iodine if you are a person who loves kale. I eat tons of kimchi and tons of sauerkraut. But I take, at least one milligram. Sometimes I take 5 milligrams, which is 5,000 micrograms of iodine a day. Now, people used to get a lot of iodine amongst the health conscious here in this country because, people ate iodized salt. A lot of people now, they kind of shoo the iodized salt to the side and they're only using sea salt. You don't get the same amount of iodine. You don't really sometimes get any iodine, any significant amount in sea salt or even in kelp or dulse. I was also under the misconception that if you ate a couple teaspoons of kelp or dulse every day, I think that can go a long ways, and in some cases it's going to work out. But the most recent research that I've looked at with taking kelp samples shows that it's so variable. You could take one sample of kelp and get less than a couple micrograms of iodine in a serving. Then you could take another sample of kelp from the same plant and you could have several hundred micrograms. So I don't really rely now on sea vegetables. I eat a lot of small oily fish. I don't even rely on that for my iodine because I eat so much in the way of kale and Brussels sprouts, and we make so much kimchi and sauerkraut. But I do take at least 1 milligram of iodine a day, and I would recommend that for almost everybody in here. If you had Hashimoto's, I'd want to talk to you first, but that's an autoimmune condition of the thyroid. But I think iodine is something that a lot of people will benefit from taking because it's just, if you're not using iodized table salt and you're eating the amount of kale that you've probably been told you should, I hate to say that, you probably need some iodine. And again, fermenting it does not get rid of the goitrogens. The isothiocyanates are actually more aggressive in their ability to cling on to iodine. Yeah?
What about just putting iodine on your skin?
Yeah, some of that will end up in your bloodstream, absolutely. I don't know the conversion or the rate, but I do know that it will end up in your blood. Absolutely. Yeah?
What about fermenting grains? I was reading about to deal with the phytate.
Absolutely.
To ferment, but what I was reading was pretty long time, like at
Oh, yeah.
temperatures, like 90 degrees. But I'm trying to think of how to practically do that.
Yeah, I think it takes 24 hours.
4 hours.
You know, temperatures that I see range from 75 to 85, but I think it's going to be a little bit warmer than room temperature. I think the key is that you see the culture forming, that you see the bubbles forming, that you know you've got good levels of microbial activity. And I think your point about what are we going to do to feed the planet, right? Beans are really the answer, but beans are so high in their phytates and their anti-nutrients, and you know, some beans are a much bigger issue than others. I tell you right now, I wouldn't touch kidney beans the rest of your life. Sorry. If there's one thing that I feel very passionate about is no kidney beans. Kidney beans are one step away from the castor bean in terms of, you know, castor beans you make ricin from. You know what ricin is, right? You can assassinate people with ricin, okay? The kidney bean is literally, there are accounts of people eating undercooked kidney beans that become very, very ill. And they, you know, when people eat a bowl of chili, they're like, oh, you know, it must have been the spices in the chili. No, it wasn't the spices in the chili, it was the kidney beans. Kidney beans are one of the absolute most difficult beans or legumes to digest because their lectin levels are through the roof. So the aduki bean is on the other end of the spectrum. If you're going to eat beans, I think the aduki bean is going to be much more well tolerated. They even cook faster. And I think that's where fermentation really comes in, to speak to both of your points, is that I think if we're going to try to feed the world, we have to use more fermentation to clean up food, to get the lectins out or the phytates out, right? It's going to take time, though. A lot of people want to just throw, you know, first of all, most people want to open up a can of beans. They don't want to cook beans from scratch. Then if I start talking about, well, you got to soak your beans for a couple days, discard the water, then I want you to let them cook for 24 hours, I just watch half the people leave the room. They're like, forget it. I'm not going to do it. Now, this is a different crowd because Mid-Coast Maine, I have a lot of people here that are really into, you know, living, you know, a better all-around holistic lifestyle. So you guys get it, but, you know, a lot of in my travels, if I start talking about soaking beans for 24 hours and then cooking them for 24 hours, people, they just start throwing stuff at me, you know. But I do think fermentation is the way to go to clean up a lot of food. You know, whether it's grains, you know, sourdough bread, for instance. If you're going to eat wheat bread, sourdough bread is the only bread to eat. If you're going to eat wheat, I don't think anybody should eat wheat, but if you are, sourdough bread is much cleaner. If you let it get really stale, this is funny, some of the starch retrogrades, and then you're going to actually give your gut a little bit higher levels of resistant starch. We're talking about 4 or 5 days here of stale sourdough bread, but whatever. I mean, if you like it, run with it, right? You can toast it, but you're going to break up the starch. Yeah, sorry. I got time for a few more questions. Yeah.
Well, John, would you just go over a list of foods that are your top 20, your top 25?
Sure, sure. I would, you know, my top 5 foods, if I were to give you 5 foods that I think you would, you know, do really well making as a staple in your diet, it's not because they give you everything you need for the day. I don't have a food that's like that. If I did, boy, I mean, it would make a lot of our lives easier. But these 5 foods are going to be foods that you could get a big percentage of what you need for the day, do not have high levels of anti-nutrients. They don't cause inflammation, whether that's in your gut or any other place. And you know, there'd be foods where if you were stranded on an island, if you had a wish list, this would be my wish list. Avocados, sweet potatoes, and I'm going to lump in yam. So if you see like Japanese yam, I mean, even though they're really sweet potatoes, but yams and sweet potatoes are good because, A, they're inexpensive. You know, they don't have to be organic. They're a good source of resistant starch. They've got a lot of micronutrients in them, not just potassium, but things like selenium. There's some vitamin E in them. You know, and your body does need carbohydrate intermittently at least. So I would put avocados, sweet potatoes and yams, almonds. The only problem with the almond is you don't want to eat too many of them because then the polyunsaturated fat content starts to add up. I'd say if you have a handful of almonds a day, you know, like a quarter of a cup, you're in great shape because the polyunsaturated fat that you get from the almond can be offset by having a little bit of oily fish, you know, a few times a week. But so I'm going to give you avocados, sweet potatoes and yams, almonds, the coconut, and whether that coconut is, you know, buying a whole coconut. You know, it's amazing. A whole coconut's like $1.50. Whenever I go through Portland, I grab like 4 or 5 coconuts. They're $1.50 a piece. It's amazing. An avocado is sometimes like $2.49. I can eat that coconut all day long. That's all I need. So, and then the fifth would be the egg. Soft boiled, poached, not cooking the yolk too much, making sure the chickens live a good life. You know, they're scratching around, having a chance to be a chicken. You know, they're not in a cage and just fed grain. Those would be my top 5. But let me go a little bit further than that, though.
Coconut milk?
Coconut milk is good. You know, make sure there's no gums like carrageenan. I don't know if you guys, a couple people in here actually forwarded it to me. I saw it earlier today. It was a good article on the emulsifiers in a lot of your non-dairy milks. What they're, you know, they've been shown to cause gut inflammation for the past few years, and they put out a good article to bring that to people's attention. But my next foods that I would encourage people to at least experiment with, if they're not staples in your diet already, would be some small oily fish, whether it's sardines or mackerel, herring, you know, alewives are great. I know a lot of you that go out and net those. We had fun doing that. My oldest boy and I last spring. So small oily fish, grass-fed meat, with lamb probably being, you know, the best of all the grass-fed meat that's typically, you know, domestic. Lamb is a higher fat content, and a lot of lamb is predominantly grass-fed, so it's got those things going for it. Then after those, I would put macadamia nuts. They're expensive, but the good thing about macadamia nuts is they're mostly saturated monounsaturated fat. They have very little polyunsaturated fat, so, you know, the cost would be the only reason you'd want to slow down in eating them. Do they have to be organic? They don't have to be. No, they're still fairly clean. They're non-GMO, so they're not bad. No, Brazil nuts have a really high level of mold on them. One of the highest levels of mold and fungus of any nut or seed. And they're very, very high, Katya, in their polyunsaturated content. So you could, you know, you go beyond just a few Brazil nuts, and you probably used up your polyunsaturated fat for the day. Other things that I would look at as staples would be some kind of fermented food, either kimchi, sauerkraut, yogurt, or kefir. And if you don't want to have dairy, then you'd obviously use kimchi or sauerkraut. And I think there's really good evidence based on Korean centenarians, people in Korea that live to be 100. Boy, they have kimchi at most of their meals. Now, let's just think about the mechanisms, how that would work in your favor. A, the people that really piss you off in life, they stay away from you. No, all joking aside, here's what it would do is that the kimchi is going to, every time you're eating something, there's the potential for there to be a slightly inflammatory response. Now, you know, we've talked about the inflammation associated with gluten in lectures past, but, you know, if you had something, let's just say you had something with a lot of polyunsaturated fat in it, and you had kimchi at that meal, the microbes that ride that cabbage and other vegetables into your lower GI, those microbes are going to offset or prevent a lot of that inflammation. So having something fermented with every meal is a great practice. I try to do it. I can't always do it when I travel, but I am able to do it when I'm at home or, you know, I'm just at my office. So I always try to have kimchi, sauerkraut, or at least a little bit of yogurt with whatever it is I eat. And some people take a probiotic, but I don't know. It would be hard. I'd be hard pressed to say, you know, that a probiotic could stand up to what you'd get in kimchi or sauerkraut, because you got a lot more diversity there than you'd ever appreciate. So those would be a few foods that I would look at as staples. In addition, you know, I would encourage people to, you know, really expand their use of sugary root vegetables like beets and carrots and parsnips. I think those are probably, again, right up there with sweet potatoes and white potatoes. They're going to be amongst your best sources of carbohydrate in the diet. You know, a carrot has a very, very small amount of fructose. Pumpkin has a very, very low level of fructose in them. So I like sugary, starchy root vegetables, and I like these, you know, really sweet, above ground, gourd type fruits like pumpkin, squash, and things like that. So those, does that help, Glenn?
What about cashews?
Cashews, yeah, a little too much sugar, but not bad. I mean, they're certainly going to be a lot better for many reasons than having sunflower seeds all the time and, you know, having too many Brazil nuts, because they at least have, you know, a lower polyunsaturated fat content. But I'm really concerned with the amount of mold that's being found in dried fruit and nuts and seeds. It's really, you know, and it all comes down to this. You know, we've got a, and I know I have to get done here in just a minute, so I'll try to answer one or two more questions. But we've got a food system that it's based on, you know, what can you put out in the way of yield for the lowest cost, lowest possible price. And, you know, so you have a lot of places that are cutting corners. You know, coffee beans are loaded with mold, loaded. And people will refute that, primarily people from the industry. I just spoke with Dean, you know, Dean himself from Dean's Beans, and, you know, it's really interesting. You've got a lot of people like Dean's Beans who are doing it right. They're getting coffee beans from altitude. They're making sure every coffee bean they harvest is wet washed, so it's processed with water. A lot of consumers see the word sun-dried and they think, oh, that must be the ticket. So I've been to Panama. I spent a couple months, you know, traveling around coffee farms and looking at the way produce is grown in Central America. And a lot of your coffee producers, they put the cherries, these are fruits, okay, the coffee cherry, they put it out in the open air, the birds crap on it, there's mold all over it, then all those cherries get thrown in a roaster, and as the consumer, you never know that the mold is there, but the mycotoxins are alive and well. Okay, and now when this research is refuted, you know what the government says or what the coffee industry says? People like Starbucks, they'll say, we test for aflatoxins in every batch. That's one type of mold, one toxin. There are thousands of molds, thousands of mycotoxins, and aflatoxin is in corn and wheat. It doesn't even like the coffee cherry as much as it does other things. So where I was going with this is I think when it comes to nuts and seeds and dried fruit, I think it's really important to stick with things like almonds and macadamia nuts, coconut, because they have much less mold, much less mycotoxins. And I'd be really careful with dried fruit because, again, that's another really serious source of these mycocontaminants, as we call them. Now, there is a solution. You know, you really just keep dried fruit to a minimum in your diet. You try to use more of the saturated fat nuts and seeds as a staple. You know, and if you have them once in a while, it probably won't come to harm you. But I think that trail mix is looked at as a healthy snack, and really when you throw all those omega-6s from the nuts or seeds into your gut with all of the fructose from the dried fruit, you turn up the level of endotoxemia in your small intestine and promote small intestinal bacterial overgrowth like no other combination. So I hope I didn't ruin trail mix for you completely, but all right, I got time for, I think, 2 questions I've gone over. Yeah?
I use a lot of the common herbs and spices with the food that I cook. I mean, like a teaspoon of a mixture
Yeah.
just thrown in with the vegetables that I steam. Is that?
I think it's great. I think it's great. I think the rule of thumb to remember is that your spices like turmeric, ginger, cumin, they need some oil or fat to actually get delivered to your body. So as long as you're cooking with a little bit of oil, I think it's great. Now the herbs, on the other hand, they're more volatile. So those you probably don't want to put in at the very beginning if it has a long cooking time. But if you're only going to cook them for a couple minutes, you're fine. But like if you threw oregano or thyme into a stir fry, in about 20 minutes, a lot of those volatile oils will be gone. But I like putting a lot of herbs and spices into your cooking. I think that's the way to go. Yeah, Nancy? You know, I think that there's really no research to show that soy or tofu causes problems with respect to things like breast cancer or major, you know, estrogen imbalances. If anything, the phytoestrogens in soy are probably going to diminish some of the estrogen imbalance that can occur in some people. My concern around soy would be digestive issues. You know, whether that would be someone who has, you know, Crohn's, ulcerative colitis. I'd also be concerned with someone who had more upper GI issues, whether that be, you know, heartburn or reflux, because soy is a digestive irritant to a lot of people. So that would be my biggest level of concern with soy. I got time for one last question. Yeah.
What place the mushrooms have in all this?
Hopefully you're going to like them with your eggs now. You got a new breakfast. You got fried eggs or poached eggs with mushrooms in the morning with a lot of butter, maybe a little bacon grease. All right, so listen, it's been great spending the night with you. Thanks, be well, take care. Thank you.